When Malcolm Macdonald says he hates someone, you better believe there's a story behind it. But here's the twist. The men on his list aren't enemies. There's something far more painful. They're the ghosts who exposed him, humiliated him, and stole the legacy he thought was his. This isn't about hate. It's about respect, forged in the fires of his most brutal defeats. And in the 1970s, nobody burned brighter or fell harder than Supermac. Malcolm Macdonald wasn't just a footballer. He was a force of nature wrapped in arrogance and delivered in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. When he arrived at Newcastle United, he didn't just play the part of the superstar, he became it. Supermac was the nickname, but Supermouth was the reality. He talked, he boasted, he made sure everyone knew he was coming, and for a while, it worked. The swagger, the confidence, the unshakable belief that he was untouchable, that was his weapon. But weapons can be turned against you, and in Malcolm Macdonald's case, his ego became the very thing that destroyed him. In the 1970s, football was a different game. It was raw, physical, and unforgiving. And in that world, Macdonald stood out like a peacock in a coal mine. He scored goals, yes. He was talented, absolutely. But more than that, he was a showman. He cultivated an image that was impossible to ignore, an unnatural high regard for himself, as one observer put it. He wanted opponents to know who he was before they even stepped on the pitch. He wanted them intimidated. Instead, he gave them motivation. He handed them bulletin board material. He turned himself into a target. The list of players he claims to hate is really a list of men who humbled him, men who didn't just beat him on the pitch, but dismantled the myth he'd built around himself. These weren't casual defeats. These were public executions, career-defining moments where the legend of Supermac crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. And the men who did it, they didn't hate him back. They respected him enough to expose him. That's the real story here. Not hate, haunting. It all begins in 1974, the FA Cup final. Wembley Stadium, Newcastle United versus Liverpool. This was supposed to be Macdonald's coronation, his moment to prove that all the talk, all the swagger, all the Rolls-Royce entrances were justified. But in the weeks leading up to the match, Macdonald made a fatal mistake. He ran his mouth. He dominated every interview, every newspaper column, every media outlet he could find. He told the world exactly what he was going to do to Liverpool, the damage he would inflict, the goals he would score, the glory he would claim. And Liverpool, led by the legendary Bill Shankly, listened. Shankly was a master of psychology himself. He knew how to motivate his players, and Macdonald had just handed him the perfect tool. Shankly pinned every single quote to the dressing room wall, every boast, every prediction, every arrogant claim. When Captain Emlyn Hughes was asked later what motivated his team that day, he gave a two-word answer: Malcolm Macdonald. The entire Liverpool squad had made it personal. They weren't just playing Newcastle. They were playing against Supermac's ego. But before the match even started, the damage was done. And it was done by a man named Tommy Smith. Smith was Liverpool's enforcer, a hard man in an era when hard men ruled the game. He had a reputation for being ruthless, uncompromising, and utterly fearless. But this wasn't about violence. This was about psychology. Smith understood that the best way to beat Macdonald wasn't to kick him off the pitch. It was to get inside his head. Before kick-off, in the tunnel, Smith approached Macdonald. The atmosphere was electric. The tension was thick, and Smith, calm as ever, asked him a simple question. Which side of the Queen do you want to sit? Macdonald, confused, asked what he meant. Smith smiled. Because that's where you'll be in a few minutes. Sitting next to royalty. Doing nothing. The line landed like a hammer. It wasn't a threat of physical harm. It was a surgical strike aimed directly at Macdonald's ego. Smith had identified the core of Supermac's identity, his belief that he belonged among royalty, among the elite, and turned it into a weapon of mockery. And it worked. Smith later said that Macdonald didn't come near him after that. The swagger was gone before the first whistle. Think about what that means. Macdonald, the man who had spent weeks telling everyone how dominant he would be, was mentally defeated before the game even started. That's the power of psychological warfare. That's what happens when you build yourself up so high that a single well-placed comment can bring you crashing down. Smith didn't need to touch him. He just needed to make him doubt himself. And in that moment, Supermac became just Mac. The aura was shattered. The confidence was fractured. And once that happens, once you start doubting yourself on the biggest stage, there's no coming back. Not in 90 minutes. Not when 100,000 people are watching. Not when you've spent weeks promising the world you'd deliver. If Smith destroyed Macdonald's mind, then Phil Thompson destroyed his body. Thompson was just 20 years old. A local Liverpool kid who had watched his team lose the 1971 final and was desperate for redemption. He was a fan who had become a player, and like the rest of the squad, he was personally fired up by Macdonald's boasts. Especially the ones aimed at him and Emlyn Hughes. This wasn't just professional, it was personal. Thompson took every word Macdonald said as a challenge. And he answered it with 90 minutes of absolute domination. Thompson's job was simple. Shadow Macdonald. Don't let him breathe. Don't let him turn. Don't let him think. And he executed it to perfection. He man-marked him out of the game. Macdonald, who had scored in every round leading up to the final, barely got a touch. He was neutralised, erased, made invisible on the biggest stage of his career. Every time he tried to make a run, Thompson was there. Every time he called for the ball, Thompson cut off the passing lane. It was a masterclass in defensive work. And it left Macdonald looking ordinary. Liverpool won 3-0. It wasn't close. It wasn't competitive. It was a statement, and Macdonald later called it horrible. That's the word he used. Horrible. Not disappointing. Not frustrating. Horrible. Because it wasn't just a loss. It was a humiliation. The entire country had watched Supermac, the man who couldn't stop talking, get completely shut down by a 20-year-old. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Macdonald, the established superstar, Thompson, the hungry youngster, and at the end of 90 minutes, only one of them looked like a champion. The irony is almost too painful to ignore. Thompson, the 20-year-old Scouser, later said that the 1974 final was the making of him. It was his most memorable personal performance, more than captaining Liverpool to the European Cup in 1981. His career-defining triumph was built on the ashes of Macdonald's career-defining humiliation. One man's legend was born, another's was buried. And it all happened because Macdonald couldn't stop talking, because he gave his opponents the ammunition they needed, because he turned himself into the villain of his own story. If you were there that night, you saw a man's legend unravel in real time. What would you have said to Supermac after that final whistle? Let us know in the comments. And if you love classic football drama, hit subscribe, because it gets even darker from here. 2 years later, Macdonald got another shot. The 1976 League Cup final. Newcastle versus Manchester City. This was supposed to be redemption. A chance to wash away the stain of 1974. A chance to prove that the humiliation at the hands of Liverpool was a fluke, an aberration, a moment of bad luck rather than a true reflection of who he was. Newcastle's record in the League Cup had been appalling. The club hadn't won a major trophy since 1969. 7 years of drought, 7 years of near misses and disappointment. And now, at Wembley again, Macdonald had the chance to end it, to silence the critics, to prove that Supermac wasn't just talk. And for a while, it looked like it might happen. Macdonald was playing well. He was involved. He was making things happen. He provided an incisive cross for Alan Gowling's goal, which brought Newcastle level at 1-1. The stage was set. Supermac was back. The script was written. And then Dennis Tuart tore it up. Tuart was a Geordie boy, born and raised in Newcastle. He'd supported the team as a child. He'd dreamed of wearing the black and white shirt. But football is a funny game. Careers take unexpected turns. And now, here he was, wearing the sky blue of Manchester City, facing his boyhood club in a cup final. The narrative was almost too perfect. The hometown hero turned rival. The prodigal son who never came home, and he was about to break Newcastle hearts in the most spectacular way possible. In the 46th minute, just after half-time, Tuart struck. An overhead kick. Not just any overhead kick, A perfect one. The kind of goal that gets replayed for decades. The kind of goal that defines careers. Macdonald himself later admitted it. He called it the most perfect overhead kick he'd ever seen. The timing of the jump was absolute perfection. He was right over the ball. He slammed it downwards. The strike was lethal. The goalkeeper had no chance. The defenders had no chance. There was nothing anyone could do. It was genius. Pure, undeniable genius. And it broke Newcastle. But here's where it gets truly painful. Macdonald doesn't begrudge the goal. He admires it. He respects it. Because how can you not? It was perfection executed by a hometown boy who had become a rival. The cruelty of it is almost poetic. They weren't beaten by luck or by a mistake. They were beaten by brilliance. And Macdonald, watching from the pitch, knew it. He understood in that moment that they were watching something special, something that would be remembered long after the final whistle. He later said that suddenly all their players felt 6 inches taller. The momentum shifted. The belief drained. And Newcastle, who had been level and competitive, suddenly looked small. The goal didn't just change the score. It changed the psychology of the entire match. Manchester City grew, Newcastle shrank, and the game was over. Years later, when Macdonald had become an adopted Geordie himself, working as a local radio analyst, he reflected on that goal, and what he said is haunting. He said he still had a strong feeling that without Dennis Tuart, they would have won the cup, and the monkey might not have been on this club's back for quite so long. That's the real weight of the defeat. It wasn't just about losing a final. It was about locking in a legacy of failure. Newcastle's last major trophy had been in 1969, the Fairs Cup, 7 years before the League Cup final, and after 1976, the drought would continue and continue and continue. For decades, the club became synonymous with near misses, what-ifs, and glorious failure. And Macdonald frames Tuart's goal as the moment that cemented it, the moment that turned a bad run into a curse. And as the team's superstar, as the man who was supposed to deliver glory, he carried that failure personally. The weight of that responsibility is something most people can't understand. When you're the superstar, when you're the one who arrives in a Rolls-Royce and tells everyone you're going to win, the failures become yours alone. It doesn't matter that 10 other players were on the pitch. It doesn't matter that football is a team game. When you put yourself on that pedestal, when you make it about you, the fall becomes yours too. And Macdonald fell twice. 2 Wembley finals, 2 defeats, 2 moments that defined not just his career, but the trajectory of an entire football club. So let's be clear about what these 3 men represent. Tommy Smith inflicted the psychological defeat. He saw Macdonald's ego not as a strength, but as a target, and he dismantled it with a single, perfectly aimed line. Which side of the Queen do you want to sit? It was a checkmate delivered before the game even started. Phil Thompson inflicted the physical and tactical defeat. He was the nullifier who erased Macdonald from the biggest match of his life, a 90-minute performance that became the making of Thompson and the unmaking of Supermac. And Dennis Tuart inflicted the historical defeat. He was the legacy thief whose moment of perfect genius denied Macdonald redemption and locked in the monkey of failure that would haunt Newcastle for generations. These aren't men Macdonald hates. They're men he respects. Because for a personality built on hubris, respect is forged in defeat. Lesser opponents could be dismissed, forgotten, written off as unworthy. But the men who truly humbled him, who neutralised his talent, broke his swagger, and denied him glory, those are the ones who earned his respect. And that respect is born from something far more potent than hate. It's born from professional agony, from public humiliation, from a denied legacy. It's born from the understanding that these men saw him at his best and beat him anyway. The tragedy of Malcolm Macdonald doesn't end on the pitch. His career was cut short by a knee injury before he turned 30. The body that had carried him to stardom gave out too soon. After football, he struggled financially. The Rolls-Royce was long gone. He battled with alcohol. The what-ifs piled up. What if Smith hadn't gotten in his head? What if Thompson hadn't erased him? What if Tuart's kick had gone wide? What if his knee had held up for just a few more years? These aren't idle questions. They're the pillars of a career that peaked with two of the most public and defining disappointments in Newcastle's history. And Macdonald, the man who arrived in a Rolls-Royce and left in the shadow of his own ego, had to live with them. The men on his list aren't hated rivals. They're ghosts. Ghosts of the legacy he never built. Ghosts of the moments when the myth of Supermac collided with the reality of football. Smith, Thompson and Tuart didn't just beat him, they defined him. They became the living, breathing proof of what Supermac could have been if only he'd let his talent do the talking instead of his mouth. And the architects of the defeats that haunt him still. In the end, Macdonald's greatest opponent wasn't any of these three men. It was himself, his ego, his need to be the centre of attention, his inability to let his performance speak louder than his words. That's the real tragedy. He had the talent, he had the stage, but he never learned that sometimes the best way to be remembered is to stay quiet and let the game do the talking. So do you think Supermac was his own worst enemy, or just a victim of football's cruel timing? Tell us below, and if stories like this keep you hooked, make sure you're subscribed. More Football Ghosts are coming next week.